Okay, so now we're going to move on to discussing costs. And really, one of the essential skills of being a really good public administrator is the ability to uncover less obvious and hidden costs and to assign them carefully in your analysis. Because some costs are very obvious and some are not. And it really is a bit of an art form when we start talking about uh, understanding costs within your organization. So let's very quickly just talk about accounting versus economics in terms of cost, because many people tend to be very familiar with cost accounting and a little bit less with managerial economics approach to costs. So accountants are concerned with primarily the collection of historical cost data, and they use that to report a firm's financial behavior, their position, and really to calculate tax liability. Economists, on the other hand, are primarily concerned with using cost data as a foundation for decision making. So while some of it is historical in concept, it's forward looking in terms of it's trying to use patterns to make decisions about the future. This leads to very different types of cost data and classifications. Economists use historic cost data, but also rely on opportunity costs in evaluating decision making. So what is the cost of taking a graduate course? There's some explicit costs, right? $3,300 for a 3-credit course. And maybe $200 out of pocket expenses for some books and some pens and some notebooks. Many people would view these explicit costs, these obvious out-of-pocket costs, as the cost of taking this course. However, as an economist, you should really be including in there all of those opportunity costs that we talked about. The cost of alternatives that we've foregone, things that we've given up in order to pursue this course. So let's take a look at what those might look like. We need to consider what you could have been doing instead of taking this course, basically. So let's assume that this is a regular semester course. It's a course in the fall. You're going to take it. There's going to be 30 classes, right? 15 weeks, 2 classes per week. They're an hour and a half long. That means that you are going to spend about 45 hours in class during that semester. But that's not the only time, right? You're going to add to that time that you spend commuting, reading, completing assignments, studying. That's going to drive the actual time spent on this course closer to maybe 135 hours per semester. That's 3 times the class meetings. If you secured a job at $10 an hour instead of taking that class, then you could have earned $1,350. And so let's say that that job where you were working $10 an hour is the most valued use of that time, the second best use to you, rather than taking this class. Then what you've given up is the ability to earn $1,350 during the semester. As an economist, that's something you have to include in the costs. So the total cost of a graduate course in the economics model will be those explicit costs, the $3,500, plus your time cost, your opportunity cost, $1,350, bring the total cost of the graduate course to $4,850. A couple of things to know is a major portion of the total cost ends up being the implicit costs. These implicit costs would be zero if you really had no opportunity to work. If you were taking this course in a foreign country, you didn't have a working visa, then that's, you have no alternative in terms of making money in a job. This implicit cost would be much higher if you have a job that you could be working instead that pays more than $10 an hour. A couple of key points that bring out here is that there's not a right and a wrong way to look at cost. The approach has to be consistent with how you're going to use the information. Accountants typically focus on explicit costs that involve actual transfer of money. Economists incorporate implicit or imputed costs because they're trying to do managerial decision making. This determination of costs is not some objective, straightforward formula. Analysts often disagree on what to include. So this again is an area where there's a bit of an art to it, and people who get comfortable with their organization and they know the full details of their organization do a better job with determining the cost because they know what to include, what's important, what might not be as important. So we talked about production functions earlier, and now what we're going to do is take a look at how production functions basically are underlying all of the cost functions that we might work with. The production function specifies the maximum quantity of output that can be produced from combinations of inputs given our current technology that we're using. The cost function just takes that production function and combines it with information about the prices of input. And then what it tells us is the cost of producing various levels of output. The short run is defined as the time period where some factors of production are fixed and others are variable. Other way of saying that is that in the long run, all factors of production are variable. So the distinction between short run and long run is not made up by some specific length of time, but it's really determined by the variability of the factors of production. How long does it take before you can make a change? Short run cost. In the short run, firms incur costs that are associated with variable inputs and others that result from fixed inputs. So their cost curve is made up of two different kinds of inputs. They have variable costs, costs that change with a change in output, and those are expressed as a function of output. So your variable costs are a function of how much output you want to create, because you're going to have to change your inputs, your variable inputs, in order to accomplish that. Fixed costs do not change with output, right? Because you can't alter them. Whether you create 0 units of output or 1,000 units of output, you still have your fixed cost being exactly the same. In that sense, they're just a constant. They're just a constant number in the equation. So some examples of fixed costs include things like rent. You sign a lease and it's a 5-year lease on the building. Well, whether you create 1 unit or 1,000 units of output, you still have to pay your lease payments. You still have to pay your rent. Property taxes. If you buy the building instead, you still have property taxes that, regardless of what your productivity level is, those property taxes will be paid, and you have to pay them for as long as you have on your mortgage, for example. Some types of equipment and insurance fit this. You might have insurance that is required of you in order to be a legally operating business. It has nothing to do with your output. It just, in order to have your business be in legal standing, you have to have a certain type of insurance. That would be a fixed cost. Short run total cost is your fixed costs plus your variable costs. Your fixed costs are fixed and constant. That's represented by the K. And your variable costs are things that you can actually change. They're the inputs that you have the ability to change. And so they're a function of output. That's the f of q. The more output you want, you're going to have to change your variable inputs, and that changes your variable costs. Graphically, it's represented this way. The green line is your total cost line. And again, this is just linear, right? And so what's happening here is you have these two other costs that make up total cost. Here we have variable cost, the yellow line. And you'll notice it parallels perfectly total cost. However, variable cost comes out of the axis at 0. It's 0. If you're not producing anything, if you're not paying for any inputs, you're not paying for any variable inputs, you have 0 output, but you also have 0 variable cost. But total cost doesn't go through the axis. Total cost starts at 50. That's because of this blue line. At every level of output from 0 to 50, you're always going to have $50 worth of fixed cost. Those are the costs that we have put in place that we cannot change regardless of how much output we create. So therefore, the total cost curve starts at 50. Why? Well, because if I produce 0, I have 0 variable costs, but I still have to pay my fixed costs of 50. If I decide that I want to create 20 units of output, I am going to have to pay $50 worth of fixed costs. I always have to pay $50 of fixed costs. But I will also incur $50 of variable costs. 50 plus 50 will give me $100 of total cost. If I decide to create 50 units of output, I will again have $50 of fixed costs. My variable costs will be somewhere up here. Looks like it might be, I don't know, 125. And then if I add the $50 of fixed costs to that, I will get my total costs, which are up here, maybe 175. So that's how these three things work together, and that's short term. We know short-term costs. You'll know it when you see it because total costs equal fixed costs plus variable costs. All right, so that's short-run costs, and you'll always recognize the short-run cost because total cost equals fixed costs plus variable costs. And that's the whole definition of short-run, is that you have some costs that are fixed. Long-run costs do not have anything fixed. Everything is variable. We use long-run costs in managerial economics to really plan over the growth of our firm. Factory size, we can change that. Machinery speed, we can change that. Size of our staff, we can increase or decrease that. And so what we tend to do is use language that talks about returns to scale. And a firm can have increasing, constant, or decreasing returns to scale in the long run. And I'm going to explain what those three things are. So let me talk about increasing returns to scale first. So we're in a setting, we're in the long run, where we can change everything. And suppose we increase all of our inputs by some proportion, let's say 50%. If we have increasing returns to scale, our output will increase by more than 50%, by more than that proportion. So that we're talking about increasing our staff size and increasing the number of natural resources that we use in the production process and increasing the size of our factory, right? All things that will be fixed in the short run are no longer fixed in the long run. So everything can change. And if we increase all of our inputs by some proportion, then our output will increase by even a greater proportion. If that should happen, It's called increasing returns to scale, and that means that our per unit costs of production are actually lower. We actually can lower them by increasing our inputs and increasing our outputs. If we have constant returns to scale, what this says is that increasing all of our inputs by some proportion increases our output by the same proportion. If we increase our inputs by 50%, we will see a 50% increase in our output. In this setting, the per unit costs remain the same in the long run. We will have more inputs, we'll have more outputs, but on a per unit basis, on an average basis, the cost will remain the same because both inputs and outputs increased by exactly the same proportion. Decreasing returns to scale say that if we increase all of our inputs by 50%, we're going to see our output increase, but by less than 50%. So output will increase at a lower proportion than our input. If this is the setting we find ourselves in, then in the long run, we're going to see per unit costs increase. Our average cost, our cost per unit, is going to increase. Why? Because the proportion of output is lower than the proportion of increase in input. So that's one way that economists will look at the long run. They'll talk about changing the size of production, changing the input structure, and see whether or not that gives them lower per unit costs in the future, the same per unit cost in the future, or higher per unit cost in the future. One thing I want to point out that's used quite often, a term that's used in the not-for-profit sector, is something called the cost disease. So William Baumol, an economist, actually came up with this concept, and he talked about you could divide the economy into two sectors. And in one of these sectors, the one that tends to be more technology intensive, you see that you get improved methods of production, and you actually see productivity grow on average about 4% per year. There's this constant increase in productivity. That happens in sectors like manufacturing, again, that are technology intensive. But then there's a second sector where productivity is relatively constant. And things like performing arts, education, medicine, they tend to fall into that constant productivity. We don't see really big changes year to year in terms of productivity. And what he showed was that rising productivity in the first sector affects all firms, regardless of what sector they're in, because it increases the demand for services, and then all firms face higher wages. This is a real problem for the sector with constant productivity because they're getting the same level of output, right? But they're getting increased per unit costs. And so it becomes more and more expensive to produce the same amount of output. Not-for-profits are particularly resistant to productivity gains by nature of the kinds of goods and services that they produce. And it makes them highly susceptible to this cost disease problem. And it's something that we see talked about quite often in healthcare and in education, higher ed especially. And so this is a problem that economists tend to focus in on with the not-for-profit sector. And it's something that you have to look at and be very careful in terms of being an administrator and planning future growth. Because what tends to be the pressure for a nonprofit that's experiencing this is there's very little you can do to bump up your productivity. You're in this sector that is plagued by a rather stagnant productivity growth. So you have choices to make, and that is to cut quality or to reduce your output in order to try to reduce your input costs. And both of those pressures are usually things that most administrators fight very strongly against.